To President Traore, the reincarnation of Thomas Sankara, President Traore, who has led the struggle to complete the unfinished business that was started by our ancestors and our Pan-African leaders in 1963 when they created the Organization of African Unity.
Why have the Western leaders, including the French president, started to fear Burkina Faso's president Ibrahim Traore? Not only them, but also those African leaders who have stayed loyal to the West now seem to be panicked. Well, that's because Ibrahim Traore has decided to do something that will collapse the exploitative system set by the West in Africa. Therefore, all those African leaders who benefited from such a system will be exposed and have nowhere to go. But what bold and radical plans Ibrahim Traore has made that have created shockwaves? Well, Dr. Arikana, the former permanent representative of the African Union in the United States of America, has openly said that Ibrahim Traore is the reincarnation of Thomas Sankara and is preparing to follow his unfinished plans. But what are they, and how are Western and African leaders in panic now? Let's know about that in this video.
Pour ce qui concerne le Burkina Faso, aujourd'hui nous sommes confrontés depuis plus de 8 ans à la forme de manifestation la plus barbare, la plus violente du néocolonialisme, de l'impérialisme. L'esclavage qu'on tend encore à nous imposer.
The connection between the West and Africa runs deep. For centuries, Africa has been a rich source of natural resources coveted by Western powers eager to strengthen their own economies. However, this pursuit of wealth has come at a significant cost to the continent, perpetuating a cycle of poverty and stagnation. Central to this issue is the legacy of colonialism. European powers, driven by a hunger for wealth and dominance, divided Africa into colonies, exploiting its people and resources for their own gain. This period of colonization fundamentally altered Africa's economic, social, and political landscape, leaving a lasting imprint on the continent. One enduring consequence of colonialism is the profound disparity in wealth and power. African economies were often structured to benefit the colonizers, with resources extracted and shipped off to the West, hindering local development. This exploitative pattern laid the groundwork for the economic inequalities still evident in Africa today. Despite gaining independence, many African nations continue to grapple with the lingering effects of neocolonialism, a system in which former colonial powers, alongside other Western nations, maintain influence over African economies and politics. This influence manifests in various forms, including economic exploitation, political manipulation, and cultural domination. Economic exploitation remains a key feature of the relationship between the West and Africa. Western corporations, often backed by their governments, exploit African resources for their own gain, offering little benefit to local communities. This exploitation extends beyond resources to include unfair labor practices, trade imbalances, and burdensome debts, further deepening Africa's dependence on the West. Political interference is another characteristic of neocolonialism in Africa. Western governments and multinational corporations exert influence over African governments through diplomacy, financial incentives, and covert operations, undermining national sovereignty and perpetuating a system where African leaders prioritize Western interests over their own people's welfare. Cultural imperialism also plays a role in reinforcing Western dominance in Africa. Through media, education, and popular culture, Western norms overshadow indigenous African cultures, eroding identity and reinforcing perceptions of Western superiority, exacerbating power imbalances and dependency. That's when Ibrahim Traore knows African leaders face a daunting challenge. They must balance the imperative to address their people's needs and foster national development with navigating a global system that favors Western interests. Many leaders choose to align themselves with the West in exchange for support, often to the detriment of their own constituents. The result is a vicious cycle of dependency, with Africa relying on Western aid and investment to sustain its economies while struggling to achieve meaningful development. Despite its abundant resources, Africa lags behind in economic growth, social progress, and political stability. This paradox underscores Africa's predicament. Its wealth enriches Western economies, yet its people endure poverty and deprivation, reliant on Western assistance instead of harnessing their own resources for development. This reality serves as a stark reminder of the enduring legacy of exploitation and injustice shaping Africa's trajectory. But what has Ibrahim Traore said about the West's puppets in Africa?
Ce qui est le problème, c'est de voir des chefs d'État africains qui n'apportent rien à ces peuples qui se battent, mais qui chantent la même chose que les impérialistes en nous traitant de milices, en nous traitant donc d'hommes qui ne respectent pas les droits de l'homme. De quels droits de l'homme parle-t-on? Nous nous offusquons contre cela et c'est honteux. Il faut que nous, chefs d'État africains, nous arrêtons de nous comporter donc en marionnettes qui dansent à chaque fois que les impérialistes tirent sur les ficelles. Hier, le président Vladimir Poutine a annoncé donc l'envoi de céréales en Afrique. Nous sommes bien contents. Nous lui disons merci pour cela. Mais aussi, c'est un message passé à nous, chefs d'État africains, parce qu'au prochain forum, nous ne devrons pas venir ici sans avoir assuré, pour ceux qui ne connaissent pas la guerre, l'autosuffisance alimentaire de nos peuples.
The world has not seen Ibrahim Traore as angry as he was about the African heads of states. Burkina Faso's Ibrahim Traore emerged as a vocal critic of African leaders whom he perceives as serving as puppets for Western interests rather than prioritizing the needs and interests of their own people. His critiques cut to the heart of a long-standing issue in African politics, the tension between national sovereignty and external influence, particularly from Western powers. Traore's criticisms highlight a pervasive sentiment among many Africans that their leaders, despite being elected to represent the interests of their citizens, often prioritize aligning with Western powers over serving their own nations. This phenomenon is not unique to Burkina Faso, but rather reflects broader dynamics across the continent. At the core of Traore's critique is the perception that African leaders, despite presiding over nations rich in natural resources, have failed to harness these resources for the benefit of their own people. Instead, they prioritize the interests of foreign powers, particularly Western countries, over those of their own citizens. This perceived subservience to Western interests is seen as particularly egregious given Africa's vast wealth in natural resources, ranging from minerals to agricultural land. Despite this abundance, many African nations continue to struggle with poverty, underdevelopment, and economic dependency. Traore's criticism extends to the practice of African leaders seeking aid from Western countries despite the continent's resource wealth. He argues that the reliance on foreign aid perpetuates a cycle of dependency and undermines Africa's sovereignty. Rather than empowering African nations to develop independently, aid often comes with strings attached, further entrenching Western influence and control. One of the most striking aspects of Traore's critique is his willingness to confront African leaders directly, calling them out for betraying their people's trust. He accuses them of hypocrisy, condemning their willingness to travel to Western capitals to solicit aid while neglecting the potential for self-reliance and development within their own countries. Traore's outspokenness has resonated with many Africans who share his frustration with the status quo. His criticisms have sparked debate and reflection on the role of African leaders in shaping the continent's future and the need for greater accountability and transparency in governance. Traore's message serves as a reminder of the importance of African agency and self-determination in charting the continent's course. He calls for African leaders to prioritize the interests of their own people, to resist external influence, and to work towards building strong, independent nations capable of harnessing their own resources for development. But what's shocking, Ibrahim Traore has said that is shaking the exploitative system the West has established.
Nous avons bien appris une chose. L'esclave qui n'est pas capable d'assumer sa révolte ne mérite pas que l'on s'apitoie sur son sort. Nous ne nous apitoyons pas sur nos sorts, on ne demande pas que quelqu'un s'apitoie sur notre sort. Le peuple burkinabé a décidé de lutter contre l'île terroriste en mesure de relancer son développement. Dans cette lutte, des vaillants peuples, des vaillantes populations se sont engagées à prendre les armes face au terrorisme, ceux que nous avons affectueusement appelés les VDP, des volontaires. Nous sommes surpris de voir les impérialistes traiter ces VDP de milices et de tout type. C'est décevant parce qu'en Europe, lorsque des peuples prennent les armes pour défendre leur patrie, on les traite de patriotes.
The narrative surrounding security threats and terrorism has long served as a justification for Western countries to involve themselves in Africa. Often framed as issues of national security, these perceptions have acted as a convenient pretext for Western intervention in African affairs, allowing them to pursue their own interests under the guise of combating terrorism. While the emergence of extremist groups in certain African nations has undoubtedly raised legitimate security concerns, critics argue that Western powers have exploited these fears to further their own agendas. This includes securing access to Africa's abundant natural resources and bolstering their geopolitical influence in the region. A significant example of this trend is the deployment of Western military forces to Africa under the guise of counterterrorism operations. While these missions claim to target extremist groups and stabilize fragile states, they frequently serve broader strategic goals, such as safeguarding Western interests and gaining access to critical resources. The presence of Western troops in Africa has afforded Western governments considerable influence over local politics and governance. In some cases, Western-backed military interventions have directly contributed to installing leaders perceived as sympathetic to Western interests, reinforcing the continent's reliance on the West. Furthermore, the influx of Western troops has facilitated the expansion of Western companies into African markets, particularly in sectors such as oil, mining, and infrastructure. These firms often operate with the backing and protection of Western military forces, enabling them to exploit Africa's resources for their own profit while offering minimal benefit to local communities. Ibrahim Traore said that this arrangement perpetuates a neo-colonial relationship between the West and Africa, wherein African nations are essentially treated as pawns in a larger geopolitical game. Western powers leverage their military and economic might to maintain control over Africa's resources, while African leaders perceived as aligned with the West receive political and financial support. But Ibrahim Traore has decided to end this once and for all. He has decided to take a bold stance against terrorism and Western hypocrisy. Traore's clear declaration that the people of Burkina Faso will take up arms to protect their country shows how far he is ready to go when it comes to Burkina Faso's sovereignty. Traore said that Africans defending their homelands are unfairly labeled as militia, while Europeans engaged in similar actions are praised as patriots. By highlighting this stark disparity, Traore exposes the inherent hypocrisy often embedded within Western discourse on security and terrorism in Africa. The notion that Africans safeguarding their territory are somehow seen as less legitimate or deserving than their European counterparts reflects a deeply rooted colonial mentality that continues to shape perceptions of power and privilege on the global stage. Traore's readiness to challenge this narrative serves as a powerful reminder that the fight against terrorism transcends regional or ethnic boundaries and necessitates solidarity and cooperation across borders. Moreover, Traore's refusal to yield in the face of Western criticism shows his determination to safeguard the security and prosperity of Burkina Faso and other African nations. Despite facing pressure and condemnation from Western powers, Traore remains resolute in confronting the security challenges facing his country head-on, refusing to be intimidated or silenced by external pressures. At the heart of Traore's vision lies a firm belief in the inherent potential of African nations to forge their own paths and achieve prosperity and independence on their own terms. By advocating for unity and solidarity among African nations, Traore aims to free the continent from the constraints of neo-colonialism and pave the way toward a brighter and more equitable future for Africa as a whole. Traore envisions a future for Africa characterized by unity, prosperity, and autonomy from Western interference and exploitation. He envisions a continent where African nations stand shoulder to shoulder, empowered to determine their own destinies and unlock their full potential, free from external constraints. In pursuit of this vision, Traore recognizes the importance of addressing the underlying causes of insecurity and instability in Africa, including poverty, inequality, and marginalization. By addressing these root issues directly, Traore seeks to create the necessary conditions for sustainable development and lasting peace across the continent. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. But what radical plans Ibrahim Traore has revealed that are disturbing the West and their puppets in Africa?
Bien sûr, nous avons lancé l'idée, d'ailleurs qui n'est pas bien appréciée par certains de la CEDEAO. Voilà, vous avez dû voir des images dans certaines conférences où ils ne sont pas d'accord qu'on puisse fédérer. Et il faut que les gens comprennent qu'un rang dispersé, ça sera difficile. On va se battre, mais il faut que l'Afrique arrive à s'unir. Et plus on s'unit, plus on est efficace. Nous sommes en train d'évaluer actuellement beaucoup de choses avec le Mali, surtout sur le domaine économique. Sur le côté défense, déjà, on a des accords, hein, ça c'est déjà scellé. Les Maliens viennent chez nous, c'est la même armée. On fait tout ensemble, on s'entraîne ensemble, on combat ensemble. Terrestre, aérien, tout se passe bien.
Between the great African leaders Thomas Sankara and Ibrahim Traore, no one worked for African unity. Even if superficial attention was paid, nobody actually worked to make all African countries one. But Ibrahim Traore has already done it. Ibrahim Traore's dedication to fulfilling the vision of Pan-African leaders like Thomas Sankara by leading the charge in building a unified Africa signifies a pivotal moment in the continent's story. Rooted in a deep understanding of Africa's historical and present challenges, Traore's vision responds to the complex tactics employed by Western powers to control and exploit the continent's vast resources. At the core of Traore's mission is the recognition of the harmful effects of the divide-and-rule strategy systematically deployed by Western powers to sow discord and disunity among African nations. Through inciting internal conflicts and exploiting existing divisions, the West has effectively manipulated African leaders, perpetuating a cycle of dependency and exploitation. Traore understands that a primary vulnerability exploited by the West is the fragmentation among African nations. This division leaves these nations susceptible to external coercion, allowing Western powers to impose their agendas and extract resources to the detriment of African progress. Nevertheless, Traore refuses to accept this status quo and is steadfast in challenging the prevailing narrative of African disunity. He firmly believes that fostering greater cohesion and collaboration among African nations can help alleviate external pressures and pave the way toward prosperity and self-determination. To bring his vision to life, Traore has taken tangible steps to foster unity among African nations. A significant undertaking is the establishment of a confederation between Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, an action that showcases Traore's commitment to strengthening African unity and resilience. What this confederation means is that if one of the countries is attacked, all of them will declare war and fight together. This confederation signifies a strategic leap toward consolidating regional cooperation and integration. By uniting neighboring countries with shared interests and objectives, Traore aims to create a framework for collective action and mutual support, spanning critical areas such as security, trade, and development. Moreover, Traore's confederation serves as a blueprint for broader Pan-African collaboration. He envisions expanding this alliance to include other African nations, gradually forming a continent-wide network of solidarity and cooperation. Traore envisions building a united front capable of addressing external challenges and advancing the continent's shared interests by forging strong bonds among African nations. At the heart of Traore's vision lies the understanding that African unity is not only a means of resisting external interference, but also a pathway to realizing the continent's full potential. By harnessing the collective talents, resources, and aspirations of its people, Traore envisions Africa emerging as a global powerhouse, characterized by strength, resilience, and self-reliance. In Traore's vision, a united Africa serves as a beacon of hope, a continent where nations stand together in solidarity, empowered to shape their destinies and determine their future. Through collaborative efforts toward common goals, Traore believes Africa can overcome the remnants of colonialism and forge a brighter, more prosperous future for generations to come. But who are the West's puppets in Africa that Ibrahim Traore targeted? Well, to know that, one has to see in depth. The obstacles encountered by leaders like Ibrahim Traore, who advocate for African unity and dismantle exploitative systems, should be the focus. Those who are creating these obstacles are the actual puppets of the West in Africa. Traore's vision, aimed at unifying Africa, directly challenges the prevailing status quo, posing a substantial threat to the influence wielded by Western powers and their allies over specific African nations. This resistance primarily stems from the apprehension of losing power and privilege among those who benefit from the exploitative systems perpetuated by Western dominance. Numerous African leaders are complicit in perpetuating these systems, driven by their vested interests in maintaining the existing status quo. Often, these leaders align themselves with Western powers, either voluntarily or involuntarily, to safeguard their own positions of authority and privilege. They frequently reap the benefits of economic and political arrangements that prioritize the interests of external powers over the well-being of their own citizens. Traore's advocacy for African unity challenges the divisive narratives propagated by these leaders. By fostering collaboration and solidarity among African nations, Traore aims to disrupt the exploitative systems that have historically divided and weakened the continent. However, opposition to Traore's vision extends beyond African leaders alone. Western powers, who have historically profited from Africa's division and exploitation, also have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. They perceive any move toward African unity and independence as a direct threat to their interests and influence in the region. Consequently, Western powers often employ covert or overt tactics to undermine efforts toward African unity. These tactics include imposing economic sanctions, exerting diplomatic pressure, or even resorting to military intervention to destabilize governments and suppress movements for change. However, all these hurdles are created using the puppets in Africa and not directly. The imposition of sanctions on countries like Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, nations that have expressed support for Traore's vision of African unity, serves as a stark illustration of the lengths to which Western powers will go to safeguard their interests. These sanctions are strategically crafted to weaken the economies of these countries and undermine their governments, thereby impeding their ability to pursue policies that challenge the existing power dynamics. African leaders who oppose Traore's vision and align themselves with Western powers are often the puppets serving external interests rather than the needs of their own people. By perpetuating systems of exploitation and dependency, these leaders contribute to their country's continued subjugation to foreign control. The resistance faced by Traore also underscores the broader struggle for self-determination and sovereignty within Africa. For centuries, the continent has endured external interference and exploitation, with Western powers dictating the terms of economic, political, and social development. Traore's advocacy for African unity represents a call to free Africa from the legacy of colonialism and neo-colonialism. It is a call to reclaim Africa's rightful place on the global stage, liberated from external interference and exploitation. Despite encountering resistance from internal and external forces, the pursuit of African unity remains a formidable challenge. Nevertheless, leaders like Ibrahim Traore persist in inspiring hope and rallying support for a new vision of Africa, one characterized by unity, prosperity, and freedom from external domination. Realizing this vision hinges on the willingness of African nations to unite in solidarity and defiance against external pressures. Achieving this goal will require courage, determination, and an unwavering commitment to the principles of unity, self-determination, and sovereignty. As long as leaders like Ibrahim Traore are willing to take charge, the dream of a united and liberated Africa remains within reach. What do you think? Is Ibrahim Traore the man who can do Thomas Sankara's unfinished job? Will he face resistance and probably be replaced as the West did with Thomas Sankara? In the comment section right below, share your thoughts on Ibrahim Traore's strategy to befriend Russia and China so the West stays away from him. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.